They say the ocean keeps no records. They say it swallows history without a trace, washing away the evidence of our triumphs and our failures. But sometimes the silence of the deep is so loud it screams. In the summer of 1945, a ship sailed out of San Francisco, carrying the power to end a world war. She was the pride of the fleet, the greyhound of the sea. She was steel, speed, and absolute confidence. She was the machine that never missed. But in just 12 minutes the machine broke, and 900 men were left floating in a nightmare that defies imagination. They were abandoned, not just by their ship, but by the very country they served. They were left to face the sun, the madness of thirst, and the teeth of the ocean's oldest predators. How does the greatest navy on Earth simply lose its flagship? How do hundreds of men vanish into a clerical error? And what really happens to the human mind when it is stripped of hope and surrounded by monsters? Tonight, we are not just reciting dates and coordinates. We are going into the water. We are going to peel back the layers of the official report to find the terrifying, human truth underneath. We are going to drift in the current with the men the world forgot. So turn down the lights, settle into your chair, and let's pay our respects to the ghosts of the Pacific. This is the story of the USS Indianapolis. There is a silence in the middle of the Pacific Ocean that does not exist anywhere else on Earth. It is not the silence of a library or the quiet of a church. It is a heavy, suffocating silence. It is the sound of deep water, water that stretches down for miles, pressing against the eardrums of the world. It is a place where human history usually leaves no mark. A ship passes, and the wake vanishes in minutes. A plane flies over, and the sound is swallowed by the wind. The ocean keeps no records. It only keeps secrets. In the summer of 1945, the Pacific was the stage for the largest conflict the human race had ever manufactured. But even with thousands of ships and millions of men churning through the waves, the ocean remained vast, indifferent, and mostly empty. It was a wilderness of blue that could hide entire fleets. It could hide the future. And as it turns out, it could hide a tragedy so profound that it would take decades for the full weight of it to be understood. To understand what happened in that black water, you must first understand the machine that was sent to challenge it, the USS Indianapolis. She was not just a ship. She was an aristocrat of the sea, a Portland-class heavy cruiser, 610 feet of gray steel, bristling with 8-inch guns that could hurl a shell over the horizon. She was built for speed, designed to hunt, stripped of heavy armor so she could outrun anything she couldn't outgun. She was the flagship of the Fifth Fleet. President Roosevelt had stood on her deck. Admirals preferred her quarters. She was a floating city of confident men, a vessel that had earned 10 battle stars. She was the greyhound of the sea. In July of 1945, there was a feeling aboard the Indianapolis that the war was winding down, that the great machine of American industry had finally crushed the resolve of the Japanese Empire. The crew, nearly 1,200 men, walked the decks with a swagger earned by survival. They were the lucky ones. They were the crew of a ship that never missed, a ship that seemed charmed. They believed in the steel beneath their feet. They believed in the chain of command. They believed that in the modern age, with radar and sonar and radio, a ship of this magnitude could not simply vanish. But confidence is a dangerous thing in a war zone. It blinds you to the variables you cannot control. It makes you forget that nature does not salute officers, and the ocean does not respect reputations. The Indianapolis was about to sail out of history and into myth. She was about to become a ghost story, and on her deck, standing watch or sleeping in the sweltering heat of the berthing compartments, were the men who would pay the price for that confidence. Among them was a young Marine named Edgar Harrell. Edgar was not born to the sea. He was a boy from the limestone hills of Kentucky, a place of green pastures, tobacco fields, and solid earth. He grew up in a world defined by predictability. You planted in the spring. You harvested in the fall. You went to church on Sunday. You prayed to a God who watched over the sparrow. In Edgar's world, survival was a matter of hard work and obedience. If you followed the rules, if you honored your father and mother, if you did your duty, you would be okay. When the war came, Edgar, like millions of others, felt the pull of something larger than his farm. He enlisted. He traded the overalls of a Kentucky plowboy for the crisp uniform of the United States Marine Corps. He was trained to fight, trained to stand straight, trained to repress fear. He was assigned to the Indianapolis, a posting that many would have envied. To be a Marine on the flagship was to be the elite of the elite. He stood guard in the polished corridors. He manned the guns. He watched the ocean roll by day after day, a shifting landscape of endless blue that looked nothing like the hills of home. Edgar brought his Bible with him. He kept it close. He read the Psalms. He trusted in the structure of the military just as he trusted in the structure of his faith. There were officers above him who knew the course. There were captains who knew the navigation. There was a navy that tracked every movement of every vessel. He was a small cog in a massive, victorious machine. He had no reason to believe that the machine was flawed. He had no reason to suspect that the very bureaucracy that put him in that uniform would, in a matter of days, completely lose track of his existence. The mission that brought the Indianapolis to the brink of disaster was so secret that the captain himself wasn't told what he was carrying until they were underway. It began in San Francisco. Strange crates were loaded aboard under the cover of heavy guard. A large wooden canister was lashed to the deck, surrounded by Marines with orders to shoot anyone who got too close. Inside the ship, in the officers' quarters, a lead-lined bucket was welded to the floor. The crew whispered. Sailors always whisper. They guessed it was gold. They guessed it was a new type of engine. They guessed it was scented toilet paper for General MacArthur. They laughed about it. But the officers didn't laugh. The tension on the bridge was palpable. The orders were simple. Speed. Absolute speed. The Indianapolis was to race from San Francisco to the island of Tinian, thousands of miles away, stopping for nothing. If they sank, the priority was not the men. The priority was the cargo. They were carrying the components for Little Boy, the atomic bomb that would be dropped on Hiroshima. The ship tore across the Pacific, setting a speed record that still stands today for the journey between San Francisco and Pearl Harbor. They were outrunning time. They were delivering the end of the war. They arrived at Tinian on July 26, 1945. The cargo was offloaded. The mysterious canister. The heavy bucket. It was all taken away by men who didn't speak to the crew. The mission was a success. The Indianapolis had done her job. She had delivered the lightning bolt that would break Japan. And this is where the tragedy truly begins. Not with an explosion, but with a sigh of relief. The tension broke. The crew relaxed. They were done. They received orders to proceed to the Philippines, to the island of Leyte, for gunnery practice before rejoining the main fleet. It was supposed to be a milk run, a routine transit through the backwaters of the war. Captain Charles McVeigh, the commanding officer, a man of pedigree and experience, asked for an escort. It was standard procedure for a capital ship to travel with destroyers, smaller, agile ships equipped with sonar to hunt submarines. A heavy cruiser like the Indianapolis was a prize target, and while she was fast, she was blind to what lay beneath the waves. She had no sonar gear to detect a submerged enemy. The request was denied. The Navy's logic was cold and bureaucratic. The war was almost over. The waters between Guam and Leyte were considered safe, a back area. The destroyers were needed elsewhere. The intelligence reports, which showed Japanese submarine activity in the area, were not passed on to Captain McVeigh. He was told the route was clear. He was told to zigzag at his discretion. He was told, essentially, that he was alone. So on July 28th, the Indianapolis departed Guam, turning her bow toward Leyte. She was sailing alone. She was sailing without eyes underwater. And she was sailing into the path of the Imperial Japanese Navy's submarine, I-58. The mood on the ship was lethargic. It was hot. The Pacific equator is a furnace, and the Indianapolis had no air conditioning. Below decks, the temperature could rise above 100 degrees. Sailors slept in their underwear, sweating through the canvas of their hammocks. Many dragged their bedding up to the topside decks, looking for a breeze, sleeping under the canopy of stars. It was a Sunday. The ship moved at a steady 17 knots. The engines hummed, a rhythmic, comforting vibration that resonated through the steel bones of the vessel. Edgar Harrell was there amidst the heat and the hum. He had finished his watch. He found a spot on the quarterdeck to sleep. It was too hot below. He lay down on the hard steel, using his life jacket as a pillow. The night was overcast. Clouds obscured the moon, turning the ocean into a sheet of black velvet. Visibility was poor. To the human eye, the line between sea and sky was erased. Captain McVeigh, judging the visibility to be low enough to hide his ship, ordered the cessation of zigzagging. Zigzagging, the practice of turning the ship in irregular patterns to throw off torpedo aim, was exhausting for the crew and slowed their progress. Under the cover of darkness, he believed they were safe. He retired to his cabin. The ship cut a straight line through the dark, but they were not invisible. A few miles away, a periscope broke the surface. Lieutenant Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto of the I-58 had been hunting for days without success. He was tired. His crew was desperate. The war was going badly for Japan, and the Kaiten, human suicide torpedoes strapped to his deck, were a grim reminder of the cost of failure. When he raised his periscope that night, he saw a shadow against the slightly lighter horizon, a black silhouette, a warship. It was moving straight. It was not zigzagging, it was the perfect target. Hashimoto couldn't believe his luck. He calculated the speed, he calculated the range. He ordered a spread of torpedoes. He did not use the suicide weapons. He used conventional Type 95 torpedoes, the long lances of the deep. He fired. On the deck of the Indianapolis, the time was 12:14 a.m., July 30th, 1945. The silence of the Pacific was shattered not by a sound, but by a concussion. The first torpedo slammed into the starboard bow. It didn't just hit the ship, it erased 40 feet of it. The explosion shredded the steel plating like paper, vaporizing the men sleeping in the forward compartments. The ship shuddered violently, a metallic scream of twisting iron that threw men from their bunks and knocked sailors off their feet. Edgar Harrell woke up to the world ending. One moment he was asleep on the quarterdeck, the next he was airborne. The vibration of the engines was replaced by a deafening roar. Before the crew could even draw a breath, the second torpedo hit. This was the killing blow. It struck midships, directly under the fuel bunkers and the powder magazine. The explosion was catastrophic. It ripped the bottom out of the ship. 3,500 gallons of aviation fuel ignited instantly, sending a pillar of fire shooting up through the ship's superstructure. The blast incinerated everything in its path. It blew out the electrical systems. The lights flickered and died. The communication systems were severed. The engines, still running, began to drive the ship down. The Indianapolis didn't just sink, she was pulled down. She was traveling at 17 knots, and with her bow blown off, she began to scoop up the ocean. Thousands of tons of water rushed in. The ship listed sharply to the starboard side. Chaos took over. There was no time for organized drills. There was no PA system to issue orders. In the darkness, lit only by the hellish glow of fires and the red battle lamps, men scrambled for the high side. The air was filled with the acrid smell of cordite, burning flesh, and heavy fuel oil. Edgar Harrell scrambled to his feet. He looked forward and saw that the bow was gone. The ship was tilting crazy, rolling over. He heard the screams of men trapped below decks, men who would never make it out. The lucky ones were topside, but even they were fighting gravity. The deck became a wall. It took only 12 minutes. 12 minutes. That is the time it takes to boil an egg. That is the time it takes to listen to 3 songs. In 12 minutes, a 600-foot majestic cruiser, the pride of the fleet, the home of 1,200 men, rolled over and plunged into the abyss. Edgar stood on the rail as the ship capsized. He looked down into the water. It wasn't water anymore. It was a sludge of oil, debris, and fire. He had to jump. If he stayed, the suction of the sinking ship would drag him down with it. He leaped. He hit the oil-slicked water and went under. He kicked, fighting the suction, fighting the debris. When he broke the surface, gasping for air, choking on the thick, foul taste of bunker sea oil, he turned to look back. The stern of the Indianapolis rose up into the night sky, towering hundreds of feet in the air like a tombstone. The giant propellers were still turning, spinning uselessly against the stars, and then, with a groan that sounded like the earth splitting open, she slid under. She was gone. Edgar Harrell was alone in the dark. But he wasn't truly alone. Around him, in the black soup of the Pacific, were hundreds of other heads. 900 men had made it off the ship. 300 had gone down with her. 900 men were now floating in the middle of the ocean, thousands of miles from land, with no food, no water, and very few life rafts. The silence returned. The roar of the explosion faded. The hiss of the steam vanished. All that was left was the sound of men calling out names in the dark. "Chief? Lieutenant? Jimmy?" They were covered in oil. It coated their eyes, blinding them. It filled their noses, burning their lungs. It made them slippery, impossible to hold on to. They grabbed at debris, crates, nets, ammo cans, anything that floated. The initial feeling was shock, numbness. The mind cannot process a transition that fast. 12 minutes ago, they were sleeping in a floating city. Now they were bobbing in an infinite liquid void. But there was also hope. They were the Navy, they were the Indianapolis, they had just completed a top-secret mission. They were overdue at Leyte. Surely, the distress signal had gone out. Surely the radio operators had tapped out the SOS before the power died. "They'll be here in the morning," men said to one another, spitting oil. "The planes will be here by dawn." They believed in the machine. They believed in the system. They huddled together in groups, shivering as the adrenaline wore off and the cold of the open ocean set in. They formed circles, holding hands, locking arms to stay afloat. The wounded screamed in the center of the pods. The healthy worked to keep them up. Edgar Harrell found a group. He treaded water. He prayed. He washed the oil from his eyes and looked at the horizon, waiting for the sun. He didn't know yet that the distress signal had never been heard. He didn't know that. Because of the secrecy of their mission, the port directors at Leyte were not expecting them at a specific hour. He didn't know that a series of human errors and bureaucratic apathy meant that no one was looking for them. And he didn't know what was happening beneath his feet, because the explosion hadn't just attracted the attention of the men on the surface. Sound travels fast in water, 5 times faster than in air. The concussion of the torpedoes, the screech of the sinking steel, the thrashing of 900 struggling bodies, it had sent a shockwave through the deep. The ocean has its own predators, ancient things, perfect machines of their own, designed by millions of years of evolution to sense vibration and blood. As the sun began to rise on that first morning, revealing a desolate, empty horizon with no ships in sight, the men of the Indianapolis realized they had survived the sinking. But they had not yet survived the sea. Beneath them, in the twilight zone of the deep, shapes were beginning to move. Shadows were rising. The blood in the water was a dinner bell. Edgar Harrell floated in his cork life jacket, the morning sun warming his face. He felt a sense of relief that he was alive. He thought the hard part was over. He was wrong. The ship was the easy part. The machine was gone. Now, they were just flesh in a world of teeth. The first day broke clear and hot. The oil slick began to break up, spreading into thin rainbow ribbons across the swells. The men took stock. They had almost no water. The few rafts were overcrowded with the wounded. Most men, like Edgar, had nothing but a kapok life jacket, a vest filled with fibrous material meant to keep a man afloat for 48 hours. After that, it would become waterlogged and sink. They had 48 hours. That was the timeline. "Quiet," an officer shouted. "Save your energy. Don't thrash." They drifted. The currents pushed them apart. The large group of 900 began to fracture into smaller clusters, drifting miles away from each other. Discipline began to fray. And then the first scream came. It wasn't a scream of panic or despair. It was a scream of sudden, sharp pain. It came from the edge of the group. A sailor was suddenly jerked upright in the water, his eyes wide with confusion, and then yanked violently downward. He vanished. The water bubbled. A cloud of red bloomed in the blue. The men froze. They tucked their legs up to their chests. They knew what it was. Every sailor knows what lives in the Pacific. Sharks. Oceanic whitetips. They are not like the sharks near the beaches. These are open ocean hunters. They are aggressive, fearless, and opportunistic. They had arrived. The grand ambition of the Indianapolis was over. The active rise had ended. The ship was rust on the bottom of the world. Now, the act of reality began. Edgar Harrell watched the red cloud dissipate. He gripped the shoulder of the man next to him. The ocean was no longer just a void, it was an arena, and the only thing separating them from the monsters below was a thin layer of canvas and faith. The sun beat down. The thirst began, and the fins began to circle. This was only the beginning of the first day. The sun dropped below the horizon on that first evening, and with it went the illusion of order. Night at sea is not like night on land. On land, there is always ambient light, the glow of a city, the reflection of a distant town, the silhouette of trees. In the middle of the Pacific, when the sun vanishes, the world simply ceases to exist. You are suspended in a void of absolute ink. The only way you know you are still alive is the stinging of the salt in your eyes and the shivering of the man tied to your arm. For the survivors of the USS Indianapolis, the first night was a collision of physical agony and psychological shock. They had spent the day waiting for the drone of an engine. They had scanned the sky until their retinas burned, but the sky remained empty. As the darkness settled, the temperature plummeted. The water, which felt warm during the midday roast, began to leach the heat from their bodies. Teeth began to chatter. It sounded like 1,000 typewriters clicking in the dark. They were drifting in groups now, huddled together in what they called pods. Some pods were small, 3 or 4 men clinging to a crate. Others were massive, tangled knots of humanity, 300 men or more, bound together by life jackets and fear. They tied themselves to one another with shoelaces, belts, and strips of torn shirt. They created a floating raft of flesh. The logic was simple: stay together, stay warm, stay visible. If a plane came, a big group was easier to see. If a shark came, surely it wouldn't attack a crowd. But the ocean does not respect the logic of the herd. Edgar Harrell found himself in one of these large groups. He was cold. The fuel oil that coated his skin had hardened into a sticky, irritating tar. It clogged his pores. It burned his eyes. But the cold was worse. It was a creeping numbness that started in the toes and worked its way up. You had to keep moving to stay warm, but moving burned energy and they had no food. It was a slow arithmetic of death. Then the ocean began to wake up. During the day, the sharks had been cautious. They were scouts, shadows passing deep in the blue. But at night, the dynamic changed. The oceanic white-tip shark is a nocturnal hunter. It relies on sensing vibrations in the water, and to a shark, 300 shivering, kicking, praying men sound like a dinner bell, ringing across miles of open water. It started with bumps. Men would feel a rough, sandpaper texture graze their legs in the dark. A nudge, a test. The sharks were curious. They were investigating these strange, soft shapes bobbing on the surface. Then the screaming started. It is a sound that no one who was there ever forgot. A scream in the water is different. It is wet, gurgling, and cut short. In the pitch black, you couldn't see who was taken. You could only hear the splash, the thrashing of water, the sudden intake of breath, and then the silence. Sometimes the man next to you would just be gone. The line tying you together would snap taut, pulling you under for a terrifying second and then go slack. You would pull it up and there would be nothing at the end of it. Panic is contagious. When a shark attacked the edge of the pod, the men in the center would try to climb over each other to get away. They clawed and kicked, pushing their shipmates down to lift themselves up. The center of the group became a crush of bodies, a drowning machine. The weak were shoved under. The wounded were suffocated. And all the while the predators circled, waiting for stragglers to drift loose. Edgar Harrell learned quickly that the center of the group was safe from teeth but dangerous for air. The edge was death, but the middle was chaos. He spent that first night treading water, praying, listening to the boys from Kansas and Ohio and New York cry out for their mothers. He realized then that the hierarchy of the Navy was gone. There were no officers here. There were no enlisted men. There was only meat, and those waiting to eat it. When the sun finally rose on the second day, it did not bring relief. It brought a new form of torture. The sun in the Pacific is a hammer. It beats down with a relentless, radioactive intensity. There is no shade, there is no escape. The light reflects off the water, doubling the exposure. Within hours, the men's faces began to blister. Their lips cracked and bled. The oil on their skin fried them. Their eyes swelled shut, a condition called photokeratitis, snow blindness caused by the glare. But the real enemy was not the heat, it was the thirst. A human being can survive weeks without food. But without water, the clock ticks fast. The body begins to cannibalize itself. The blood thickens. The kidneys shut down. The brain begins to shrink. They were floating in millions of gallons of water. Crystal clear, blue, inviting water. It lapped against their chins. It splashed into their mouths. It was cool and wet. And every single man knew the rule: do not drink the salt water. The officers who were still lucid swam through the groups, croaking out orders through swollen tongues. Don't drink. If you drink, you die. But willpower is a finite resource. As the second day dragged on, the thirst became a physical madness. It wasn't just dry mouth. It was a screaming need, a fire in the throat that nothing could extinguish. Edgar watched as the discipline broke. It usually happened the same way. A sailor, often a young kid, would go quiet. He would stare at the water. He would cup his hands. He would take a sip. Just a little one, he'd tell himself, just to wet the lips. The relief was instant. The cool liquid soothed the fire. But the salt is a poison. It dehydrates the body further, pulling water out of the cells to flush the sodium. The thirst returns 10 times worse, so the man drinks again, and again. Within an hour, the delirium sets in. The salt poisons the brain. The men who drank went mad. It wasn't a gradual decline, it was a violent snap. They began to thrash, they began to babble, they foamed at the mouth, their eyes rolled back, wild and unseeing, and then the hallucinations began. This is the part of the story that sounds like fiction, but it is documented in the testimony of almost every survivor. The dehydration and the heat caused a mass psychosis. The ocean became a canvas for their desperate desires. Men began to see things that weren't there. "There's the island," someone would shout, pointing a trembling finger at the empty horizon. "I see the palm trees, I see the hotel." "The ship is just below us," another would scream. "The Indianapolis didn't sink. She's sitting on a sandbar just 10 feet down. The galley is open. They have ice-cold water in the scuttlebutt." These weren't just idle thoughts. They were vivid, shared realities. Entire groups of men became convinced that an island was just a mile to the west. "Come on, boys," they would yell. "Let's swim for it." And they would detach themselves from the safety of the pod. They would swim away, weak strokes cutting through the swell, heading for a mirage. Edgar watched them go. He watched his friends, men he had served with, men he trusted, swim confidently toward nothing. They swam until their hearts burst, or they swam until the sharks found them. They never came back. Others believed the ship was below them. They would take off their life jackets. "I'm going down to get a drink," they would say, calm as if they were walking to the corner store. And they would dive. They would slip beneath the surface, chasing a phantom ship, and drown in the deep blue. Edgar had to fight his own mind. He heard the voices. He saw the visions. He saw fresh water springs bubbling up from the ocean floor. He saw his family farm in Kentucky floating on the waves. But he held on. He bit his lip until he tasted blood, just to focus on something real. He clung to his faith, reciting the 23rd Psalm over and over, using the rhythm of the words to keep his brain tethered to reality. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." But he did want. He wanted water. He wanted it more than he wanted to live. By the afternoon of the second day, the ocean had transformed into an asylum. Men were fighting each other. Paranoia set in. In their delirium, some men believed the sailors around them were Japanese spies. They believed they were being sabotaged. Fights broke out. Men with no strength left tried to strangle each other in the water. Knives were pulled, and through it all, the sharks circled. They were bolder now. They didn't just wait for the night, they came in the daylight. They sensed the weakness. They sensed the dying. The sharks of the Indianapolis were not mindless killing machines. They were efficient. They didn't attack the tight knots of healthy men. They waited for the stragglers. They waited for the ones who swam away toward the hallucinated islands. They waited for the ones who died of thirst and went limp in their life jackets. Edgar saw a shark take a man just a few feet away. The water was clear enough to see the grey shape rise from the deep. The shark didn't rush. It glided. It rolled its eye back, exposing the white, protecting it from the thrashing. It opened a mouth that seemed too large for its body, a cavern of serrated rows. It bit down on the sailor's thigh and shook its head, a violent thrashing motion designed to tear meat from bone. The water turned red. The man didn't even scream. He was too weak. He just looked at Edgar with eyes that were already dead, and then he was pulled under. As the sun began to set on the second day, the survivors were a broken remnant of the crew that had entered the water. The optimism was gone. The hope of rescue was gone. They realized with a terrifying clarity that the world had forgotten them. The Navy didn't know where they were. The silence of the radio was the silence of their tomb. The second night was worse than the first. The adrenaline was gone. The bodies were failing. The cold returned, sharper this time. The life jackets, designed for 48 hours, were beginning to waterlog. They sat lower in the water. The waves washed over their faces more often, forcing them to swallow the deadly salt spray. Edgar's group had shrunk. The man on his left was dead, but they couldn't untie him because the knots were wet and tight, and their fingers were too swollen to work them. So they dragged the corpse with them, a silent companion. In the dark, the sharks returned with renewed aggression. They bumped the legs of the living and the dead alike. They were tasting, testing. Edgar felt something brush his foot, rough skin, heavy muscle. It wasn't a piece of driftwood. It was a predator passing beneath him, deciding if tonight was his time. He froze. He held his breath. He didn't kick. He didn't pray. He just existed, a speck of life in a universe of death, waiting for the verdict of the monster below. The shark passed, but the night was long, and miles away, in a comfortable office in the Philippines, a port director logged the arrival of other ships, unaware that the Indianapolis was missing. The ledger was incomplete, a clerical error, a checkbox unmarked, and because of that small, paper silence, hundreds of men were dying in the dark. The machine of bureaucracy had failed them. The machine of the ship had failed them. Now, nature was taking them apart, piece by piece. Edgar looked up at the stars. They were beautiful, bright, cold, and indifferent. He wondered if anyone was looking up at the same stars, thinking of him. He wondered if he would ever see the sun rise again. He closed his eyes and drifted. Act 2 was the peak of the horror, the realization that they were alone, the breakdown of the mind. But Act 3 was coming. The crisis, the moment where the body gives out, and the spirit is all that remains. The moment when the line between the living and the dead would vanish completely. Day 3 was dawning, and the ocean was not done with them yet. The sun rose on the third day, but it did not bring light. It brought clarity to the horror. By this point, the ocean had changed. The water was no longer blue. In the center of the survivor groups, the water was a murky, swirling cocktail of fuel oil, blood, and human waste. But it was what floated in that soup that broke the spirit of the men. By day 3, the ratio of the living to the dead had shifted. The life jackets, the kapok vests that were the only thing keeping them from the abyss, were indiscriminate. They held up the breathing and the breathless with equal buoyancy. The dead bobbed shoulder to shoulder with the living. Their heads rolled with the swells, eyes open, staring at the sun that had killed them, faces baked to a charcoal black by the ultraviolet radiation. The survivors faced a grim logistical choice, a moral calculus that no human being should ever have to perform. To keep the group together, they had tied the life jackets of the dead to the living. But now the dead were a burden. They were dragging the group down. They were attracting the predators. "Cut them loose!" a voice rasped. It was a dry, cracking sound like sandpaper on wood. The men fumbled with the knots. Their fingers were swollen sausages, twice their normal size, ulcerated by the salt water. They couldn't feel the ropes. They had to use their teeth, biting through the oil-soaked canvas strips to release their friends. When a body was cut loose, it didn't sink immediately. It drifted. It moved slowly away from the pod, carried by the current. And then, usually within minutes, the water around it would boil. The sharks had learned the rhythm. They knew that a drifting shape meant an easy meal. The survivors would watch, numb and silent, as the corpse of a friend, someone they had played cards with in the mess hall, someone they had enlisted with, was thrashed about on the surface and then pulled under. There was no funeral service. There were no words, just the splash, the tear, and the empty space where a man used to be. Edgar Harrell watched this procession of death. He was drifting in a state of semi-consciousness. His body was failing. The skin was sloughing off his hands and face. The ulcers from the salt water were eating into his flesh. But his mind was still miraculously intact. He clung to the discipline of his upbringing. He told himself that if he gave up, if he let go of the will to live, he would become just another drifting shape for the sharks. But the sharks were no longer satisfied with the dead. On the third day, the attacks changed. The caution was gone. The predators had assessed the threat level of the prey and found it to be 0. They began to attack the living right in the center of the groups. It happened in flurries. A feeding frenzy is a clinical term, a biological description. In reality, it is an explosion of violence. One shark strikes, the blood hits the water, and it triggers a chemical chain reaction in every other shark nearby. They lose their instinct for self-preservation. They become biting machines. The water around Edgar erupted. Fins slashed through the surface. Tails slapped the water with the force of baseball bats. Men were screaming, not just in pain, but in sheer primal terror. The ocean was churning. Edgar felt the displacement of water before he saw the shark. A massive pressure wave hit him. Then, a grey wall of sandpaper skin slammed into his side. He was spun around. He saw the eye, that flat, dead, doll-like eye, rolling back. He saw the mouth opening, rows of serrated triangles designed to shear through bone. The shark wasn't attacking him directly. It was thrashing through the group, snapping at anything that moved. But then it turned. It locked onto him. In that moment, Edgar Harrell ceased to be a civilized man. He ceased to be a Marine trained in the Geneva Convention. He became a cornered animal. He didn't swim away. You cannot outswim a shark. He didn't play dead. He fought. As the shark lunged, Edgar drove his fist into the animal's nose. It was like punching a concrete wall covered in wet leather. The impact jarred his shoulder, sending a shock of pain through his exhausted body. But the nose is a shark's sensitive point. The predator flinched. It thrashed, its tail whipping around, striking Edgar in the chest, knocking the wind out of him. He went under, swallowing a mouthful of the toxic oil-water mix. He gagged, kicking wildly. He surfaced, gasping, and saw the fin coming back. He screamed, a sound of pure rage. He kicked out with his heavy boots, aiming for the gills, the eyes, anything vulnerable. He struck something solid. The shark veered off, diving deep, perhaps deciding that this particular piece of meat was too much trouble when there were so many easier meals floating nearby. Edgar hung in the water, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He was alive, but for how long? While this medieval horror played out in the middle of the Pacific, a different kind of horror was taking place 4,000 miles away. A horror of silence. A horror of paper. To understand why the USS Indianapolis was still floating in pieces, why no rescue ships were cresting the horizon, you have to look away from the blood and look at the ink. You have to look at the machine of the United States Navy. The Indianapolis was a victim of the very secrecy that had made her famous. When she delivered the atomic bomb components to Tinian, she had effectively erased herself from the standard tracking grid. Her mission was so classified that her movements were known only to a handful of high-ranking officers. When she left Guam for Leyte, she was sent into a gap in the system. There was a directive in the Pacific Theater at that time. It was a rule regarding the reporting of combat ship arrivals. The rule stated that combat ships, battleships, cruisers, aircraft carriers were not to be reported upon arrival unless they were overdue. But there was a nuance, a fatal flaw in the logic. The port directors at Leyte had a board on the wall, a grid showing expected ships. The Indianapolis was on that board. Her ETA was Tuesday, July 31st. When Tuesday came and went, and the Indianapolis did not appear in the harbor, the officer on duty did not sound the alarm. He did not pick up the radio, he simply assumed she had been diverted. After all, she was the flagship. Admirals changed plans for flagships all the time, without telling the junior officers at the port. Furthermore, the standing orders were interpreted to mean, don't clutter the airwaves with arrival reports. The silence was the default. If a ship arrived, you said nothing. If a ship didn't arrive, the assumption was that she was safe elsewhere. It was a system designed for secrecy, not safety. It was a system that assumed the machine was infallible. So on the third day, as men were being eaten alive, a clerk in Leyte simply removed the card for the USS Indianapolis from the expected column. He didn't move it to arrived. He didn't move it to overdue. He just took it down. In the eyes of the Navy, the ship effectively ceased to exist. There was no search launched because officially no one was missing. The 195 men of the Indianapolis had fallen through a crack in the paperwork, no wider than a sheet of carbon paper. Back in the water, the concept of Navy had lost all meaning. There was only the now. Day 4 brought the disintegration of reality. The hallucinations that had begun on Day 2 now became the dominant experience. The group mind fractured. It wasn't just individuals seeing things anymore, it was shared delusions. A sailor would shout, "The supply ship is here. It's just below the surface. They have fresh milk. They have ice cream." And 3 or 4 others would nod eagerly, their cracked lips stretching into ghastly smiles. "I see it," they would whisper. "I see the hatch." And they would dive. They would unclip their life jackets, the only things keeping them in the world of the living, and swim down into the darkness. Edgar watched them go. He watched the bubbles rise as they exhaled their last breath, chasing a phantom of comfort into the crushing depths. They didn't drown in panic. They drowned in hope. They drowned swimming toward a lie. Those who remained on the surface were entering a catatonic state. They bobbed like corks. Their skin was grey. Their eyes were swollen shut. They had ceased to be men and had become biological debris. Edgar was drifting in and out of a coma. He was having conversations with his mother. He was walking through the tobacco fields of Kentucky. The smell of the curing leaves was so real he could taste it. He could feel the solid earth under his bare feet. It was a beautiful, seductive feeling. It pulled at him. "Just let go," the voice said. "Just sleep. The pain will stop." He recited the Lord's Prayer, but the words were getting jumbled. The syntax of his faith was breaking down under the weight of his biology. "Our Father, who art in the water, hallowed be thy name." By the morning of the 5th day, Thursday, August 2nd, the 900 men who had gone into the water had been reduced to just over 300. 600 men had died. They had died of thirst. They had died of exposure. They had died in the jaws of sharks. They had died by their own hand, drowning themselves to escape the madness. The remaining survivors were scattered over hundreds of miles of ocean. The current had torn the large groups apart. Edgar was with a small cluster now. They were silent. They no longer looked for planes. They no longer looked for ships. They were waiting to die. The end was not a dramatic event. It was a fading, a slow turning down of the volume. Edgar felt his heart beating. A slow, thumping rhythm, thump, pause, thump, pause. He knew with the detached clarity of the dying that he wouldn't last another night. The cold of the coming evening would finish him. And then a sound. It was not the sound of the ocean. It was a drone, a low mechanical hum. It was distant at first, a vibration in the air that he felt in his chest more than he heard with his salt-crusted ears. He didn't look up. He had heard phantom engines for 3 days. It was just another hallucination, a cruel trick of the auditory nerve. But the sound got louder. It grew from a hum to a roar. It was the sound of internal combustion, the sound of the 20th century returning to the primeval void. High above at 800 feet, a PV-1 Ventura patrol bomber was flying a routine sector search. The pilot was Lieutenant Chuck Gwynn. Gwynn was not looking for the Indianapolis. He didn't know the Indianapolis was missing. No one did. He was looking for Japanese submarines. He was flying a boring standard patrol, fighting the monotony of the endless blue. He was tired. The plane was vibrating. And then, a minor mechanical issue occurred. An antenna wire on the tail of the plane came loose. It began to whip around in the slipstream. Gwynn was annoyed. He handed the controls to his co-pilot and went to the back of the plane to reel in the wire. He opened a small hatch in the floor to guide the winch. While he was wrestling with the wire, he happened to look down. Through the small opening in the floor of the bomber, Framed by the metal fuselage, he saw the ocean, but it wasn't blue. It was a long, dark streak, an oil slick. In war, an oil slick usually means a submarine, a damaged enemy sub, bleeding fuel. Gwyn's instincts kicked in. He scrambled back to the cockpit. "Dive," he ordered. "Submarine contact." He pushed the nose of the Ventura down. The plane screamed toward the water, dropping from 800 feet to 100 feet, preparing to drop depth charges. Gwyn's finger hovered over the release button. He was ready to kill. He leveled out, roaring over the oil slick at 200 miles per hour. He looked out the window, scanning for the periscope, scanning for the silhouette of the enemy U-boat. He saw the oil. He saw the debris. And then he saw the dots, hundreds of black dots. He blinked. Mines? No, mines don't move like that. Seals? No, too far from land. He banked the plane sharply, bringing it around for a lower pass. He dropped to 300 feet. The roar of the engines shook the water. Down below, Edgar Harrell heard the noise increase to a deafening thunder. He forced his swollen eyelids open with his fingers. He looked up. A plane. A twin-engine Angel made of aluminum. It was so low he could see the rivets. He could see the star on the wing. He tried to wave. He tried to shout. But his arm wouldn't lift. His voice was a croak. He just watched, tears cutting through the oil on his cheeks. Up in the cockpit, Chuck Gwyn felt the blood drain from his face. Those weren't mines. Those were heads. Men. Hundreds of them. They were splashing. They were waving feeble hands. "My God," he whispered into the intercom. "Those are men." He didn't drop depth charges. He opened his bomb bay doors, but not to kill. He dropped everything he had that could float. Life rafts, radios, water cans, sonar buoys. Then he did something that would save them but also torture them. He climbed back up to altitude to transmit a message. Sighted approximately 150 survivors in water, lat long. The message went out. The radio silence was broken. The secret was out. But as the plane circled overhead, dipping its wings to signal, "I see you," a terrible realization washed over the men in the water. The plane couldn't land. It was a bomber, not a seaplane. It couldn't pick them up. It could only watch. And as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, marking the end of the 5th day, the sharks, agitated by the noise of the plane and the splashing of the dropped rafts, began to circle with renewed interest. The survivors were spotted, but they were not saved. Gwyn watched his fuel gauge. He was running low. He would have to leave soon. He looked down at the wretched, dying humanity spread out on the uncaring sea. He knew that by the time a ship could get there, it would be night again. And he knew what happened in the water at night. The race was no longer against the Japanese. It was a race against the sunset, and the sun was falling fast. Hope is a dangerous thing in the middle of the ocean. It burns energy. It raises the heart rate. And when the sun began to set on that 5th day, the hope that had been ignited by the passing bomber began to curdle into despair. The plane had flown away. The sky was emptying. The shadows were lengthening. The sharks, agitated by the noise and the falling debris, were gathering. Edgar Harrell lay in the water, his skin sloughing off in sheets, his mind drifting between the Kentucky hills and the abyss. He knew the night was coming. He knew he didn't have the strength to fight off the predators one more time. The machine of his body had run out of fuel, but help was coming. It just wasn't the help the Navy had ordered. Lieutenant Adrian Marks was piloting a PBY Catalina, a flying boat, miles away. He had heard the message from the bomber. He had been ordered to the scene, but his orders were strict. Observe only, do not land. The water was too rough, the swells were 12 feet high. A PBY is a fragile bird. Landing in open ocean swells is often a suicide mission. The hull would crack, the plane would break apart. Marks arrived over the site as the light was failing. He looked down. He saw what Chuck Gwyn had seen. The oil, the debris, the hundreds of heads. But he saw something else, too. He saw the strikes. From the air, the water was clear enough to see the shapes of the sharks darting into the groups of men. He saw the thrashing. He saw the survivors scattering in terror. He realized that if he didn't act, dozens more would be eaten before morning. He looked at his crew. He made a decision that would end his career or save his soul. He ignored his orders. "Stand by for a landing, Hene," he said. He dropped the PBY toward the water. He didn't just touch down. He stalled the plane onto the tops of the swells. The hull slammed into the ocean with the force of a car crash. Rivets popped. The metal groaned. Water sprayed over the cockpit. But the plane held together. It bobbed in the heavy seas, engines idling. A new island in the waste. Marks didn't stop there. He taxied the plane into the thick of the horror. He couldn't take off again. The plane was too damaged, the water too rough, so he turned the aircraft into a lifeboat. "Get them," he ordered. The crew began pulling men out of the water. It was a gruesome task. The survivors were slippery with oil. Their skin was so waterlogged that if you grabbed them by the arm, the flesh would sometimes slide off the bone. They were skeletal, dehydrated, hallucinating. They filled the fuselage. Then they filled the cargo hold. When there was no more room inside, they began stacking men on the wings. They used parachute cord to tie the survivors to the struts so they wouldn't slide back into the shark-infested water. 56 men. That is how many Adrian Marks pulled from the sea. 56 ghosts piled onto a broken airplane, floating in the dark. But Edgar Harrell was not on the plane. He was still in the water miles away from where Marks had landed. He was in a different group, drifting in the blackness, shivering, waiting for the end. The night deepened. The silence returned. And then, a light. On the horizon, a star appeared. But it wasn't in the sky. It was on the water. A beam of pure white brilliance cut through the night. It swept across the clouds, it swept across the waves. It was the USS Cecil J. Doyle. The captain of the Doyle had also made a choice. Standard procedure in submarine-infested waters is to run dark, no lights, no cigarettes, total blackout. To turn on a searchlight is to paint a target on your own back. It invites a torpedo. But the captain knew there were men out there. He knew the PBY was down. He decided that the lives of the men in the water were worth the risk of his ship. He turned on the biggest searchlight he had. He pointed it straight up into the heavens, a pillar of fire, to let every survivor for 20 miles know, "We are here." To Edgar Harrell, that light looked like the finger of God. It was the first time in 5 days he had seen something that wasn't trying to kill him. The ships arrived. The Doyle, the Bassett, the Register. They moved slowly, careful not to run over the men they were trying to save. Nets were thrown over the sides. Strong hands reached down. Edgar remembers the feeling of being lifted, not by the water, which had tossed him for 5 days, but by men. He was hauled up the steel side of a destroyer. The metal felt solid. It didn't move. He collapsed onto the deck. He tried to drink from a water fountain, but a medic pulled him away. "Not yet, son. Not yet." They cut the clothes off him. They scrubbed the oil from his body with kerosene. The pain was excruciating, but he didn't care. He was dry. He was safe. Out of the 195 men who had sailed on the USS Indianapolis, only 316 came out of the water alive. Edgar Harrell was one of them. The rescue was the end of the physical torture, but it was the beginning of the psychological siege. The men were taken to hospitals in Guam. They were skeletons with eyes. They were treated for dehydration, exposure, shark bites, and salt poisoning. But while their bodies healed, the machine that had sent them there, the United States Navy, was already beginning to spin its gears. The war ended a few days later. The atomic bomb, the components of which the Indianapolis had delivered, was dropped on Hiroshima on August 6th, just 4 days after the rescue. Then Nagasaki. Then the surrender. The world celebrated. The sailors in Times Square kissed nurses. The confetti fell. The nightmare was over. But for the Navy, there was a problem. The loss of the Indianapolis was a humiliation. It was the greatest loss of life at sea in the history of the U.S. Navy. And the public wanted to know why. Why was the ship alone? Why was there no escort? Why did it take 5 days to find them? Why did the port directors not report the non-arrival? The questions were dangerous. They pointed to systemic incompetence. They pointed to the fact that the Navy had lost track of a capital ship. The bureaucracy needed a shield. It needed a scapegoat. They found one in Captain Charles McVeigh. McVeigh had survived the sinking. He was pulled from the water expecting to be treated as a commander who had lost his ship in battle. Instead, he was treated as a criminal. The Navy convened a court-martial. It was a show trial. They charged him with hazarding his ship by failing to zigzag. They ignored the fact that zigzagging was discretionary. They ignored the fact that he had been denied an escort. They ignored the fact that the distress signals were missed. In a move that stunned the survivors, the prosecution brought in a surprise witness. The doors of the courtroom opened, and in walked Mochitsura Hashimoto, the Japanese submarine commander who had sunk them. The survivors sat in the gallery, watching in disbelief. The man who had killed their friends, the enemy, was sworn in to testify against their captain. Hashimoto spoke through a translator. He was asked if zigzagging would have made a difference. He looked at the court. He looked at McVeigh, and he told the truth. "No," he said, "it would not have mattered. I had the position. I had the range. I would have hit him anyway." It should have been an exoneration. The enemy commander himself said the captain was not at fault, but the machine had already decided the verdict. The court ignored Hashimoto's key point and focused on the technicality. McVeigh hadn't zigzagged. Therefore, he was guilty. He was convicted. His career was ruined. The Navy had its answer. The tragedy wasn't a failure of the system. It was the failure of one man. The file was closed. Edgar Harrell went home to Kentucky. He took the train back to the limestone hills. He walked back into the life of a farm boy. The cows were still there. The tobacco was still growing. The Bible was still on the nightstand. But Edgar was not the same. You cannot spend 5 days in the belly of the ocean and come back whole. He found that he couldn't sleep. When he closed his eyes, he saw the fins. He heard the screaming. He felt the oil on his skin. He would wake up sweating, gasping for air, thrashing in the sheets as if he were fighting off a shark. He couldn't stand the sound of dripping water. He couldn't explain it to his neighbors. They saw a hero. They saw a man in a crisp uniform who had helped win the war. They wanted to slap him on the back and buy him a drink. They asked him, what was it like? How do you answer that? How do you describe the sound of a man being eaten alive while you hold his hand? How do you describe the taste of salt water mixed with blood? So he didn't. He stayed silent. He built a wall around the memory. He went to church. He prayed. He tried to be normal. This was the legacy of the Indianapolis for decades. The survivors met in secret in small reunions. They drank together. They cried together. They were the only ones who understood the language of their trauma. They were a brotherhood of the damned, and watching over them from a distance was their captain. Charles McVeigh lived, but he did not survive. He received hate mail every day. Letters from the mothers and wives of the men who had died. "Why is my son dead and you are alive, Amy?" they asked. "You killed my husband." He carried that weight for 23 years. He answered every letter. He never made excuses. He took the blame that the Navy had assigned to him. In 1968, on a cold November day, Charles McVeigh walked out onto his back porch. He was an old man now. The ocean was far away. He held in his hand his service pistol. In his other hand, he held a small plastic toy sailor. A gift from a child? A talisman? No one knows. He put the gun to his head and pulled the trigger. The 880th victim of the USS Indianapolis. The ocean had finally claimed its captain. It seemed like the story would end there. A tragedy buried in a classified file. A captain disgraced. A crew forgotten. But history has a way of surfacing, just like wreckage. In the late 1990s, 50 years after the sinking, a 12-year-old boy named Hunter Scott watched the movie Jaws. He heard the character Quint tell the story of the Indianapolis. He was captivated. He decided to do a history project for school. He started digging. He interviewed the survivors. He gathered hundreds of documents, and he found the things the Navy had hidden. He found the proof that the Navy knew submarines were in the area, but didn't tell McVeigh. He found the proof that the distress signal was received, but ignored. He found the proof that the port directors had failed to report the ship missing. The project grew. It went from a middle school science fair to the halls of Congress. The survivors, now old men in their 70s and 80s, rallied one last time. They marched on Washington. They didn't want money. They didn't want medals. They wanted one thing. They wanted their captain's name cleared. In October of 2000, Congress passed a resolution exonerating Captain McVeigh. President Clinton signed it. It was too late for McVeigh. He was in the ground. But for Edgar Harrell, standing there in his dress blues, grey-haired and trembling, it was the final act of the mission. The ship had finally come home. Edgar lived to be an old man. He passed away only recently, one of the last of the survivors. In his final years, he spoke often about the ocean. He didn't hate the sharks. That is the surprising thing. When he spoke to crowds, when he wrote his memoirs, he spoke of the sharks with a strange kind of respect. They were just doing what they were made to do, he would say. They were hungry. We were in their house. He realized, in the quiet of his old age, that the true antagonist of the story was not the shark. The shark is honest. The shark shows you its teeth. The true antagonist was the silence, the indifference, the machine that treats men like numbers, the bureaucracy that values a schedule over a life, the pride that refuses to ask for help. Edgar Harrell spent 5 days in hell so that we would know what happens when we place our trust in systems rather than in one another. The USS Indianapolis lies today on the floor of the Philippine Sea, 3.5 miles down. It was found in 2017, perfectly preserved in the cold, crushing dark. The guns are still pointing forward. The hull number, 35, is still visible on the steel. It is a tomb, a monument to the grand ambition. But the legacy is not in the steel. It is in the breath of the men who came out of the water. It is in the lesson they carried back to the world of the living. The lesson is simple. We are fragile, we are small, and when the ship sinks, when the machine fails, when the lights go out and the water rises, all we have is the person next to us. Edgar Harrell held onto his shipmates in the dark. That is how he survived. That is the only way any of us survive. The ocean is vast, and it keeps its secrets. But for 5 days in 1945, it taught us who we really are.